Invite. Just going to try and advance the. So I run a project called Forest for Peterborough. I undertake a number of other types of projects, all based roughly around the natural environment. Many of the tree planting projects that we've undertaken, we've pecked through working with schools or businesses, being part of the Forest for Peterborough project. There are a number of benefits from tree planting, creating fantastic habitats for our natural world, improving the aesthetics and the beauty of a site. They also are involved in creating avoidance from pollution such as noise, dust and particles from roads, etc. The areas under trees are always cooler than those of the surrounding areas, so they can reduce ambient temperatures by as much as 15 degrees, and they provide fantastic connections to other environmental areas. Any tree planting project has 3 phases, so planning, planting and aftercare. All tree planting programs require a little forethought, so that's the layout of the site, the tree spacings, the species choice and the protection of the trees afterwards. Planting a mixed range of species is the best practice, so lots of different varieties. We plant around 20 different types of native species and we pick between those. We don't always plant the 20 species, so we pick the species that are most appropriate to the site. And that sometimes is about what our end goal is. So if we're working with schools to plant and support a forest school program, we might well decide on a number of species that would be useful in terms of finding and using resources within the forest school. For instance, we might plant elder or hazel or willow, because these are the types of trees that we often use as materials in our forest school activities. When we're planning out our site, that we will ensure that we've got enough trees to cover the site. So often we plant a few more than we'd calculated in case some of those die. This is on screen is an image of a conventional forestry planting scheme. So if you see the squares, they reflect a 2-meter spacing between the dots. So the blue dots are the trees. So in this image, we've got 9 trees being planted, and the centre of each of the tree is 2 meters from their nearest neighbour. So that's on the X and Y axis, and slightly more on the diagonal. So we see there that in a 4 square meters, an area of 4 square meters, we've got 1 tree planted. And this is for most plantation forestry processes where they are planting monoculture, so just 1 species. When we plant trees or other a planting scheme, we often, as I previously mentioned, choose between 20 native species. And what we do is we separate those bigger trees, so maybe oaks and alders and so forth, and we refer to those as our upper canopy trees. And so they're dictated in this image by the brown dots, and so they are in the same planting. If you imagine the slide before it, the distances between the blue dots, which are representative of the trees, are 2-meter spacings. Well, the same exists for this image with the brown dots. So they're still at 2 meter spacings. But if you notice that there's lots of little green dots in there as well. And so these are our smaller shrubs. And the reason we plant lots of smaller shrubs around them is to create these complex habitats. So we want lots of understory, lots of smaller shrubs growing underneath our trees. And we do this because of the environmental benefits, but also they provide the resources that for forest school. So most of our forest school activities generally use those smaller shrub species like the hazel and the elders and the willows, all being smaller trees. And so we can push more of those trees into an area. Mixed planting ensures we have more diverse habitat. We plant, where possible, those upper canopy trees concentrated towards the planting area, and then our smaller trees around those taller trees with hedging species at the very edges. And this mimics a natural structure that we would observe in any forest or woodland throughout the UK. And we get the correct layers. So three-dimensionally, we see, if we were looking at the trees from the side, we'd have the smaller species, and then towering hopefully above them in many years' time would be our upper canopy trees. So we mentioned there was 3 distinct phases to our planting schemes, and so the first part of that is our the planning, and so that's we go out and we measure our site, and then we start to think about the types of trees that we would like planted there. And so I would typically do a recce of the site and then look at the characteristics. If you're a school and you're receiving one of those free school packs, very often you might not know what trees you're going to get in the packs. There might be a suggested range of species that you might receive, and so it makes the planning of that process a little bit more difficult. What I would suggest is that if you don't know the species and you can't recognize the species when they arrive, is just to plant them at 2 meter intervals between them along the area that you're going to that you want the trees to be established in, allowing the trees not only to form a single line, but also maybe having a double line that's offset from the first line. So that's where the second line sits between the middle of the first line. You'll receive your tree packs, or if you were obtaining trees through us and we were supplying the whips in a part of a partner program, you'd find that most of the shrubs appear as 40 to 60 centimeters high, and they're either sourced as seedlings, and so a seedling is something that's been planted into a seed tray, or they are transplants, so they might appear in your tree pack as a root ball, and so they've been dug out of a trench at a tree supplies nursery. We refer to all of these young saplings as whips. They would get planned to be planted in the winter time, so when they're in their dormant stage, so that they won't contain any leaves, unless of course they're evergreen. So sometimes we might deviate from our native species and plant some native evergreens, or we might find that sometimes we have holly and the like in our tree packs, and so they're evergreen, and so we would expect to find the leaves on them. And the other thing that we would suggest and highly recommend is planting by this process called the pit method, and so that's digging holes. And so we can notch plant, where we just dig a slit into the ground and push the root in. But we don't recommend that because they experience quite a lot of losses. So when we're planting our trees in our holes, we dig a square hole. And the theory behind that is that if we were to receive a plant in a plant pot, so a round pot from a garden nursery, when you pull them out of the pot, very often the roots have gone round and round, so they've become root bound. And if we just plant that round root ball into the ground, the likelihood is that it would just carry on going round and round, and so it wouldn't establish very well. So we dig our holes in a square shape, and we dig them 20 centimeters long, 20 centimeters wide, and 20 centimeters deep. And that's the size of a small border spade. And so if you make your 4 slots in the ground, you can pull the soil out in one cube, if you like. And then we place the soil quite close to the hole. If you throw it to the side, or you've got some enthusiastic students who start throwing the soil out a little bit too far away from the hole, when it comes to planting it back in the hole, there's not enough soil to backfill the hole, and so you don't have enough soil to fill and cover the roots. So that's the important bit, is to make sure that the tree roots are all in the ground and they're covered by the soil, and that will ensure that the trees don't desiccate and they're able to establish better. Not always easy to be able to identify the tree roots. I've been on sites where they've maybe an enthusiastic volunteer has planted them upside down, so that's worth having a little check for. So here's an image of our 20 centimetre holes. It's got our whip planted in, and if you notice that the roots in the top left-hand image are all contained within the pit, and so when we backfill, all the roots are covered. And then the image to the right shows that the root and the taproot on the whip extends longer than the 20 centimetre hole, and unfortunately we'll just have to dig the hole a little bit deeper. So place your tree into the ground when you're when the hole's been dug, and just make sure that the tree's roots will be covered by the soil and won't stick up out of the ground. That's the important bit. And so if you need to dig down a little bit more, then a few centimetres more will just ensure that happens. The temptation is to try and force it in and either have the tree on its slant or bend the roots over to try and fit it into the hole, and it's always best to just dig the holes a little bit deeper. So once the tree's been placed into its hole and the soil backfilled back into the ground, a tree shelter and a support cane goes on. In the image you can see 3 different types of tree shelter designs. PEC doesn't use the plastic ones that appear in these images. We use card-based ones. So some of the eco tree shelters that are on the market are still made of plastic. So although they describe them as not photo degradable, which means that they break down under sunlight, they still release their microplastics into the environment. So we tend not to use any plastic tree shelters. We don't completely avoid using them because we would upcycle or reuse some plastic tree shelters if they were donated to us. And sometimes the tree shelter in the right hand, the lower right hand corner, you can see are much bigger, and so sometimes we get whips that have got a lot of lateral branches on them. So these are the branches that grow out to the side, and so they won't fit in our card-based ones, which are narrower. So sometimes we have to use the plastic ones to fit the trees into. And there's a little tip there, make sure that your tree fits into the tree shelters before you plant them, otherwise you can't get them on. In terms of problems and aftercare. So very often we've planted trees on sites, and enthusiastic young students come along and pull the tree out, and what should we do if that takes place? Well, just replant them. Dig a new hole, 20 centimeters deep, 20 centimeters wide, and 20 long, and replant by the method previously mentioned. So there's no alternative for that. Also limiting footballs and children's games where they might run around a newly planted area, because the whips remain fragile, and they will remain fragile for a couple of years. If a tree unfortunately gets broken in half, and you want to know what to do about that, so you can literally just take the tree shelter back off if it still has the tree shelter on, go to the branch just above the branch that's undamaged, and using some sharp secateurs, and just cut the tree top off, and the tree will reshoot and regrow back. It will change its shape, but it would still generally regrow from there. And likewise, if the tree was broken further down, maybe even just above where the tree exits the ground, you can still cut a broken tree off at the very base, and it should regrow again. So and that's effectively what happens in larger trees with coppice in. On this image, you can see a tree that's been girdled, and so something's been tied round trees. And sometimes, in forest school activities, you can see where people have hung things on trees, and to get the item they're hanging, maybe tree biscuits or different decorative things, they tie the decorative item onto the tree using cord. And if the tree has something tied round it, it will damage the bark, and over time the tree will grow round the item. And after we finish the presentation, I can demonstrate that with some props I have. Placement of trees are important. So here in the image, we've got someone who's planted a tree, and it sits under an obstruction. So when we're thinking about our own tree planting, it would be very easy to almost not notice a telephone cable or an overhanging part of a forest school building that sits somewhere, and in time that tree will cause issues. So just having a glance about when you're deciding on your area to see if there are any obstructions. So that's above ground obstructions, but the same applies for below ground obstructions like services. So don't plant trees right close to soakaways and drains, because trees have a habit of finding their roots into these structures. So it's always worth just having a little walk around the site to make sure that there aren't any obstructions. And this is something I see quite a lot. This is where a tree's been planted against the periphery of a site, and there's a chain link fence in, and what happens is that a branch eventually works its way through the chain link fence in, and then over time, as the tree grows, it grows round the chain link fence. And I've cut literally hundreds of branches of trees that have been growing through the chain link fencing. And unfortunately, even if you cut it off, you can't do anything about it. So if you have chain link fencing on your periphery of your site, then just make sure that you plant your trees indented a little further away. So think of a couple of meters away from a fencing, and over time the tree will have room to be able to grow without damaging the fencing and without the fencing damaging the tree. Something that's quite pertinent for us as a major tree planting company, and something for the trees that we've planted on various sites, as the climate change has forced hotter and drier springs, water becomes an issue, and that's right from the outset of actually receiving your tree package. So when the trees are being sent along to you, they can sometimes sit in the delivery system for a couple of days, and they're very easy, with them being small, very easy for the roots to dry out. So if you get your tree pack, the first thing to do is unpack it on that day and establish whether the roots are really dry, and if they are, stand them in a bucket of water. Now, I know that might be more difficult if you've got, one of these tree packs have got 400 tree species in there, not species, but 400 individual trees. And so just make sure that if you've got lots of trees, they are watered, or they're put in trays so the roots don't dry out before you're ready to plant them. And in terms of the site itself, there are a couple of things that you can do in terms of ensuring that when your trees have been planted, they don't desiccate and dry out. So even us, when we plant our trees in good time, dry weather can certainly kill off some of the trees, and so we might expect to lose 10% of our whips in any planting scheme through a number of different things. So they may be that they are prone to disease, or they get damaged, or they dry out, or they haven't been planted as well as they could have been. So all those things can lead into you experiencing greater than 10% tree losses. So what can you do about that? So you can leave the grass a little bit longer around your tree planting area. That helps reduce water loss, and it stops the soil from drying out. You can imagine if you have bare soil and the sun directly hits it, or you have wind blowing across the soil, it can easily desiccate it and exacerbate the drying process. So having a cover, so a ground cover of grass or other plants, certainly reduces the water loss. You can also add a mulch to it. So mulches could be wood chippings or wood barks if you have them. Many tree surgery companies will provide wood chips for free. It's a part of their, if you like, their waste products from tree processing and tree surgery. So sometimes they're available. We ourselves have had wood chips delivered to our offices to facilitate mulches around our trees to prevent them drying out. You could also use other types of organic matter, like horse muck, and those types of things could be used if they were available. If you have some sites that I've been to visit have got animals on their forest school sites. You could consider watering the trees as well. So that's the other thing. So during periods of very dry weather, watering the trees may be a necessity if they're in an exposed site. So it's about the logistics of that. So if you don't have water to the area that you're planting up, obviously that makes it much more complicated, and water is heavy to trudge across. But if you can get some water to the trees during very dry periods, then you may well assist with not losing too many. Again, there are issues that become more problematic and have become more problematic one of the ways that we can approach that is by getting your trees in good time. So but the best time to get those trees in the ground is as close to the Christmas period as possible. So we're now at the very edge of our tree planting period, and so we've got a couple of tree planting events in the next week or so, but we wouldn't want to be planting pretty much after the first week of March if we can avoid it. If we were to plant in December, it gives those trees longer to sit in their ground and to establish and to build better root systems, and the ground isn't so dry as well. I'll stop sharing my screen and then I'll take some questions if you have them, and I'll share with you some of the props I've got as well.
So one of the questions we've had, Tony, is around planting near buildings. So you've talked about overhead and underhead obstructions and fences, but what about trees and buildings?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so in terms of when we're on a site, what I would recommend is that we don't plant within 5 to 6 meters. So in old money, that's 20 foot from a building. So we tend not to do that. And unless you've got, and the sort of same applies to when you're planting against maybe a periphery of a school ground that's right next to your neighbours. So maybe some schools have housing developments that are literally connected to the school field. And so what I tend to do, out of just being polite really, is to suggest that you either get permission directly from that resident, or you don't plant trees right at the back of their house. Not everyone wants trees. They can cast quite a lot of shade onto somebody's property. That shade can be of benefit though as well for a site. So if I mentioned that the ambient temperatures are much less in a area that's got trees, so up to 15 degrees, and so having trees within 5 meters of a building could also reduce the temperatures and the amount of sunlight that pushes through windows on a really hot day. So that could be of benefit. They could also intercept the cooling effects of wind, so that would also be a benefit. It reduces the heating bills and stuff. So there's a balancing act with trees and their placement to ensure that you get the optimum benefits with the least amount of negative traits.
Thank you, Tony. We've had one more question just with regards to tree species. If you can choose the trees, what would you recommend for a school site?
I like the thing I would suggest is to go for those forest school trees. So I like hazels and stuff. They don't grow too big. You've got lots of materials that they can produce. You've got hazels in terms of the way that they grow. They have multi-stems, and so you've got lots of potential materials. I like the smaller willows like hosier, that you can make all those craft things. I like elder because they're also really good for school forest school activities. But I like things like crab apples if we're not planting fruit trees. So if you can get some fruit trees, and so you end up with apples and fruit for students, which is fantastic. But crab apples and those flowering trees provide many benefits to pollinators, and so I like a range of trees that have flowering periods at different times, so we can maximise the amount of flowering that takes place throughout the year. You know, that those, even if you have fruit trees, having crab apples can increase the pollination rates of your fruit trees by having those on the periphery. But you can also get some of the wild cherries and even some things like cherry plums, which are slightly smaller than a wild cherry species, and they flower much earlier. You know, you might expect cherry plums to be flowering now. You know, you might find that some of them are just starting to come out in bloom. You know, so they're very early flowering species. Great, you know, beautiful in terms of the aesthetics, but also fantastic in the numbers of benefits you've got for our pollinators. You know, if you get those invertebrate numbers up, you've got great food sources for our nesting birds later in the year.
Lovely, thank you, Tony. That's all the questions that we had in the chat. Was there anything else you wanted to cover?
Yeah, what I've got a couple of little props here, and so when I say a 20 centimetre space, so if I'm going to show you this, you might be able to see just this box, just slightly out of focus there, is a box that's 20 centimetres in all of its proportions. So that would be the size of hole that you would plant. And I'm going to try and, I've got a couple of whips here, and so this is it's not, you can just about see there the root system on this whip. So the tree I'm holding up here is a little hawthorn, and so if you notice that it's got this root that goes off laterally to one side, and so if I was planting that, you can see that the root system there is it's just over 20 centimeters deep. And so if I was planting this tree, I would have to make sure that all of the root was within the ground. I'm going to show you another tree here, which has got, again, so this is a blackthorn, and so if you can see that, and it has this really long root system. And so although you wouldn't necessarily need to dig a hole that's greater than 20 centimeters, you could use, here's one of the tap roots here, and so that could go into one of the corners of the square hole, and that would ensure that it establishes by pushing those roots into the ground. These tap roots are the bits of the root that provide the anchorage. So if you see the little wispy bits, they're the bits that are pulling all that moisture out of the ground, and they're going to be providing all the nutrients. And then in time, these big tap roots grow down and provide the anchorage to stop the tree blowing over, or being, especially if the ground becomes sodden in later, you know, some a winter when the tree is taller and you know, it's exposed to very strong winds. So that's the sort of method I would approach in terms of the tree planting itself, and of course seek guidance as well. You know, that's probably a piece of advice. You know, if you're unsure about the species and how it's going to grow and what the effects are for your site, is to just take some advice. And so Pectra are one of those organisations where you can seek advice from us.
Lovely, thank you very much, Tony, for that. That's been really great. Hopefully it's been useful for our attendees today in terms of what to plant on your school grounds and how to look after those trees once you've planted them. We certainly take a lot of calls and questions from schools with regards to tree planting, hence today's webinar.